It's a great privilege to do this satellite program, and I'm going to do my best, and all of the people that work with me.
After 49 years, Elvis's secret safe has been drilled open. There's a sound that metal makes when it's been locked for 49 years. It's not a click, it's not a snap, it's something closer to a sigh, like the steel itself has been holding its breath and finally, against its will, has to let go. That's the sound that filled a climate-controlled room on the second floor of Graceland in March of 2024, when a locksmith's drill bit broke through the final tumbler of a safe that was never supposed to be opened, not by the public, not by historians, and if certain people had gotten their way, not ever. The locksmith wasn't working alone. There were 3 other people in that room. None of them were family, none of them were fans. They were attorneys, forensic archivists, and one court-appointed witness whose only job was to confirm that what happened in that room actually happened. Because in cases like this, in situations where the truth has been managed for half a century by people with enough money to rewrite gravity, documentation isn't optional. It's the only thing that stands between fact and the version of fact that gets sold to you in a gift shop. The safe itself had been installed in Graceland in 1975, during a period when Elvis was still performing, but had begun to withdraw in ways that the people closest to him described as unsettling. He didn't put it in his office, the room where he handled business, where managers and lawyers and hangers-on shuffled contracts across his desk like playing cards. He didn't put it in the jungle room, the place he'd redesigned to feel like his. The one space in Graceland that looked like it came from his mind instead of someone else's decorating. He put it in a secondary bedroom on the upper floor, a room that wasn't part of the tour route, a room that even members of the Memphis Mafia, the men who lived in his house and ate at his table, were quietly told wasn't part of their access. That choice wasn't accidental. Elvis Presley lived in a house full of people, but he died alone in the bathroom with the door locked. Those 2 facts are connected, and the safe, tucked into a room most of the world didn't know existed, was part of the same logic. He needed a place that was his, a place that couldn't be entered without his permission, a place where what he put inside would stay inside until he decided otherwise. But Elvis never got to decide otherwise. On August 16th, 1977, and less than 6 hours after his body was found, that room was sealed, not by the Memphis Police Department, not by the medical examiner's office, not by Priscilla, his ex-wife, or Vernon, his father, or any of the people whose grief might have justified wanting to preserve his private space. It was sealed by associates of Colonel Tom Parker, the man who had managed Elvis's career with the kind of control that most people reserve for livestock. And it stayed sealed, legally and physically, for 49 years. The legal mechanism that kept it sealed is worth understanding, because it reveals how power works when it doesn't want to be loud. The safe and its contents were classified under Tennessee estate law as personal effects, which meant they fell under the administration of whoever controlled the Presley estate. For decades, that meant a rotating lineup of executors, business managers, and attorneys whose job was not to protect Elvis's memory, but to protect Elvis's market value. And market value in this context meant one thing above all else: control the narrative. You control what people know, you control what people buy. You control what people buy, you control a revenue stream that has generated over $1 billion since 1977. Opening the safe required a legal trigger, something that would override the administrative authority that had kept it locked. That trigger didn't exist in Elvis's original will. It didn't exist in any document he signed while he was alive. It existed in a trust amendment that was added after his death, as an amendment that included a clause stipulating that certain personal effects would remain sealed until a specific date tied to the final expiration of intellectual property protections that wouldn't even begin their countdown until decades later. The mathematics of that clause were designed to do one thing: outlast everyone who might have had a reason to ask uncomfortable questions. But mathematics, like steel, eventually gives way. The clause expired. The petition was filed. A judge operating under a legal standard that prioritized documentation over sentiment signed an order, and a locksmith was hired to do what locksmiths do, which is to open things that people have spent a great deal of effort keeping closed. When the drill bit finally broke through and the safe door swung open, the first thing visible wasn't gold. It wasn't cash. It wasn't the kind of glittering memorabilia that you'd expect a man like Elvis Presley to lock away. It was paper, stacks of it, some of it loose, some of it bound in notebooks with covers so worn the original colour had faded into something closer to grey. Pages filled with handwriting that didn't need a forensic analyst to identify, because anyone who had ever seen an Elvis autograph knew exactly whose hand had written it. And underneath the notebooks, arranged with a care that suggested intention rather than haste, were envelopes, some of them sealed, some of them addressed to people whose names the attorneys in that room recognized immediately, names that still appeared on licensing agreements and merchandising deals and estate documents filed as recently as 2023, people who were still alive. People who had spent the last 49 years insisting that everything there was to know about Elvis Presley's final years had already been said. Elvis had written them letters, and those letters had been sitting 3 feet from his bed, waiting the entire time. The first letter they pulled from the safe was dated April 12, 1977, 4 months before Elvis died. It was addressed to a lawyer in Nashville whose name doesn't appear in any official biography of Elvis Presley, which is exactly why it matters. The letter was never sent. It was written on Graceland stationery in blue ink that had faded just enough over the decades to look fragile, but the handwriting was firm. The language was clear, and the content, according to the court-appointed witness who documented the examination, was not the rambling of a man losing his mind. Yes, it was the careful, deliberate articulation of a man who understood exactly what was being done to him and was trying in the only way he had left to create a record of it. Elvis wrote that he wanted to terminate his management agreement with Colonel Tom Parker, not renegotiate it, not just the terms, end it. He wrote that he had been trying to make this happen for over a year, but that every attempt had been blocked, redirected, or quietly dismantled by people inside his own circle. He wrote that he believed his phones were being monitored, and that conversations he had in private were somehow making their way back to Parker within hours. He wrote that he felt like a prisoner in his own home, and he used that word specifically, prisoner. The financial details he included in that letter aligned with what researchers have pieced together over the years, but seeing it in Elvis's own handwriting changes the temperature of the information. Parker's contract gave him 50% of Elvis's earnings as a standard cut. In certain deals, particularly related to merchandising and film, that percentage climbed to 75. By any measure, by any standard in the entertainment industry before or since, this was extraction. Elvis Presley, the man who could sell out any venue on earth, who had generated more revenue for RCA Records than any artist in the label's history, was being financially bled by the one person who was supposed to be working for him. More than 90% of the people watching this video right now still aren't subscribed, and that means most people are missing out on exclusive, untold stories about Elvis Presley you won't find anywhere else. If you don't want to miss the next revelation, now's the time. Subscribe, hit the bell, and share this video with one friend. Now let's continue, but here's what makes the letter devastating. Elvis knew the numbers. He had done the math. He wrote in clear terms about specific deals where he suspected Parker had negotiated terms that benefited Parker's side ventures more than they benefited Elvis. He referenced a meeting in 1976 where he tried to bring in an outside accountant and was told by Parker that doing so would create unnecessary complications and damage the relationship of trust they had built. And Elvis wrote that he didn't trust Parker. He wrote that he hadn't trusted him in years. And he wrote that every person he tried to talk to about it was either on Parker's payroll or too afraid of Parker's influence to do anything that might jeopardize their own position. The journal entries go deeper. 14 months of handwritten pages, some dated, some not, covering a period from early 1976 to just weeks before his death. The entries aren't daily, they're sporadic, the kind of writing someone does when the pressure builds to a point where it has to go somewhere. And what they describe is a life that looked like freedom from the outside, but felt like captivity from within. He wrote about his medication. Not in vague terms, he named the prescriptions, he noted the dosages, and in an entry dated January 1977, he wrote that he had asked Dr. George Nichopoulos directly why the amounts kept increasing when he didn't feel like they were helping. According to what Elvis recorded, Dr. Nick told him that the prescriptions were being adjusted based on consultations with other physicians who were monitoring his overall health. But Elvis wrote that he never met those other physicians. He never consented to those consultations. And when he pressed Dr. Nick for names, the conversation was redirected. In another entry, Elvis described a night where he tried to call a doctor outside of Dr. Nick's network, someone he had known years earlier, someone he thought he could talk to without it getting back to the people managing his day-to-day life. The call didn't go through. He tried again the next day from a phone in a room he thought was private. It is that call also didn't connect. 2 days later, according to the journal, Parker mentioned in passing that he had heard Elvis was trying to reach out to some old friends and suggested that it might be better to keep medical decisions consolidated under people who were already familiar with his case. Elvis wrote that he understood in that moment that there was no call he could make, no room he could stand in, no conversation he could have that wouldn't be reported. He wrote about feeling watched, he wrote about feeling managed, and in an entry that sources describe as one of the most chilling in the entire journal, he wrote that he didn't think the pills were being given to him to make him better. He thought they were being given to him to keep him compliant, to keep him performing, to keep him from asking the kinds of questions that might interrupt the machinery that had been built around him. A machinery that ran on his voice, his face, and his inability to say no. The cassette tapes found in the safe have not been played. Their condition after 49 years of storage is unclear, and the legal status of their contents is still being contested, but their existence is documented, and the fact that Elvis recorded something sealed it. and hid it in a place that only a court order could open. Tells you everything you need to know about how much danger he believed he was in. He couldn't fire Parker, he couldn't change doctors, he couldn't make a phone call without it being intercepted, but he could write it down, he could lock it up, and he could wait for a day when the people controlling him would no longer be the people controlling the truth. There's a phrase that appears more than once in the journal entries found inside that safe, and it's not one you'd expect from a man who was surrounded by friends every day of his adult life. The phrase is, "Nobody here works for me." Elvis wrote it in February of 1977, underlined it, and then wrote it again 2 pages later, as if saying it once wasn't enough to make it real. He was talking about the Memphis Mafia, the men who lived at Graceland, who travelled with him, who appeared in photographs at his side wearing matching jumpsuits and wide grins. The men the world believed were his brothers. Elvis knew better. They were on Colonel Parker's payroll, not his, Parker's. That detail changes everything. Because it means that every conversation Elvis had inside his own home was a conversation that could be reported. Every plan he made could be intercepted. Every moment of vulnerability could be documented and used. Loyalty wasn't something Elvis bought with friendship. Loyalty was something Parker bought with checks, and the men who cashed those checks understood exactly where their obligations lay. When Elvis tried to reach outside that circle, the circle tightened. When he tried to bring in someone new, someone he thought he could trust, that person would either be absorbed into the system or quietly pushed out. There was no third option. One of the entries describes an attempt Elvis made in early 1977 to contact a lawyer in Los Angeles, someone he'd met years earlier during the filming of one of his movies, and someone who had no financial connection to Parker or the estate structure that surrounded him. Elvis wrote that he asked one of his guys to make the call on his behalf because he didn't want it traced back to him directly. The call was made, but the lawyer never called back. A week later, Elvis was told by someone in Parker's office that they had heard he was shopping around for legal advice, and that if he had concerns about his business affairs, those concerns should be brought to the people who were already managing them. Elvis wrote that he never found out whether the lawyer received the message or whether the message was stopped before it ever reached him. Either way, the outcome was the same: silence. Dr. George Nicopolis appears throughout the journal, but not in the way you might expect if you've only heard his name in connection with the prescription scandal that came after Elvis's death. Elvis didn't write about Dr. Nick as a villain, he wrote about him as someone caught in the same machine. In one entry, Elvis described a conversation where he asked Dr. Nick point blank why the medications kept increasing when they didn't seem to be making anything better. According to what Elvis recorded, Dr. Nick looked uncomfortable, hesitated, and then said something that Elvis wrote down word for word. "I'm trying to keep you functional, not healthy, functional." Elvis asked what that meant. Dr. Nick, according to the journal, said that there were pressures coming from people above him, people who needed Elvis to be able to perform, to travel, to meet obligations that had already been contracted and paid for. He said that if Elvis stopped performing, a lot of people would lose a lot of money, and that the medications were the compromise that kept everyone stable. Elvis wrote that he asked Dr. Nick who those people were. Dr. Nick didn't answer. The conversation ended, and 2 days later, Elvis's prescription for Demerol was increased. This wasn't malpractice in the traditional sense. This was something more systematic. It was a managed pharmaceutical program designed not to heal a patient, but to maintain a product. The pills weren't there to make Elvis Presley feel better. They were there to make sure Elvis Presley could still generate revenue. And every person involved in that program, as from the doctor who signed the scripts to the assistants who filled them to the handlers who made sure Elvis took them on schedule, understood that their job wasn't to protect him. It was to protect the operation. The same logic applied after he died. Within hours of Elvis's body being discovered, the rooms that mattered were locked down, not by police, not by medical personnel, by Parker's people. The safe was sealed. Certain documents were removed from Elvis's office before investigators arrived. The autopsy was conducted with a speed that multiple forensic professionals later described as irregular, and the findings were released before the toxicology was complete. The official cause of death was announced as cardiac arrhythmia. Heart failure, clean, simple. No one's fault. But the toxicology told a different story, one that didn't make it into the press release. The levels of codeine, morphine, and barbiturates found in Elvis's system were, according to independent medical reviews conducted years later, inconsistent with a sudden cardiac event. They were consistent with something else, something slower, something that had been building for months, and the people who had been managing those prescriptions, who had been managing Elvis's schedule and his access and his isolation, moved immediately to ensure that the findings stayed clinical and the questions stayed quiet. The system that controlled Elvis while he was alive didn't stop when his heart did. It just shifted form. The same people who had kept him performing kept him profitable. The same people who had made sure he couldn't speak made sure his silence continued. And for 49 years, it worked, until someone drilled open a safe that was never supposed to be opened, and and found the one thing that system was never designed to handle: evidence in Elvis's own hand, written by the one person who couldn't be discredited, bought off, or made to disappear: the victim himself. Lisa Marie Presley was 9 years old when she lost her father. She was standing in the front yard of Graceland when the ambulance pulled away, and she spent the next 45 years living inside a legacy that was less an inheritance than a labyrinth. She inherited the house, she inherited the name, she inherited a fortune that had been so thoroughly mismanaged by the time it reached her that she spent decades trying to untangle what was left from what had been taken. But more than any of that, she inherited a silence, a carefully constructed and legally reinforced silence about what had actually happened to her father in the months before he died, and she spent her entire adult life pushing against it. In interviews, Lisa Marie was careful. She had been trained by experience to understand that the wrong word could trigger lawsuits, could jeopardize licensing agreements, could bring the full weight of the estate's legal machinery down on her head, even though she was, on paper, the person that machinery was supposed to serve. But she found ways to say what she couldn't say directly. In 2013, during a conversation about Graceland and what it meant to her, she described the place as somewhere that preserves everything except the truth. Interviewers treated the line as poetic, as metaphor. Looking back at it now in the context of what was found in that safe, it reads like testimony. She tried to access the safe. This is documented. On at least 2 separate occasions, Lisa Marie filed requests through estate attorneys to examine the contents of her father's personal effects that had been sealed since 1977. Both times, she was told the materials were under legal review. Both times, she was given timelines that stretched and shifted and eventually dissolved into silence. She was the sole heir to Elvis Presley's estate, the only child of the most famous entertainer who ever lived, and she could not open a safe that sat in her own childhood home. Let that reality settle for a moment. The system that had controlled her father had found a way to continue controlling access to him, even from the grave. And the one person with the standing to challenge that system was never given the key. Once Lisa Marie died in January 2023, she was 54 years old. The cause of death was a small bowel obstruction, a complication from a surgery she had undergone years earlier. It was sudden, it was unexpected, and it happened 14 months before the trust clause that had kept her father's safe sealed finally expired. There is no public evidence connecting those two events. No investigation, no suggestion of anything other than tragic coincidence, but in a story that has been defined by timing, by documents that surface at exactly the wrong moment for the people who wanted them to stay hidden. The timing of Lisa Marie's death sits in the record like a question that no one is allowed to ask out loud. The safe was opened in March 2024. Lisa Marie was not there. The contents, the letters, the journals, the tapes. They were examined by attorneys, archivists, and court-appointed witnesses, none of whom had any personal connection to Elvis Presley or his family. The findings were documented. And then, within weeks, the suppression began. Legal correspondence was sent to multiple individuals involved in the examination. The language was polite, professional, and unmistakable. Non-disclosure agreements were offered. Some were signed, others were declined, and the people who declined them reported experiencing what one described as a sudden cooling of professional relationships in ways that made it difficult to continue working in their field. No lawsuits were filed, no public accusations were made, just the quiet, whole systematic application of pressure by people who understood that the most effective way to bury a story is not to attack it, but to make the people who know it too afraid to speak. The Presley estate has made no public statement about the contents of the safe, no confirmation, no denial, nothing. The silence is strategic, because as long as the estate doesn't acknowledge what was found, they don't have to answer for it. They don't have to explain why Elvis Presley's own writings describe a man who was being exploited, medicated, and surveilled by the people who were supposed to protect him. They don't have to explain why those writings were sealed for 49 years while the estate generated billions of dollars selling a version of Elvis that his own journals contradict. They don't have to explain anything. And if they have their way, they never will. But here's what the attorneys and the licensing executives and the people who have built careers managing the Elvis Presley brand don't understand. Elvis found a way. He couldn't fire his manager. He couldn't change his doctor. He couldn't make a phone call without it being intercepted or walk into a room without being watched. But he could write. He could seal what he wrote in a safe that only a court order could open. And he could wait. He waited 49 years. And now his voice is out. The man who was silenced in 1977 is finally speaking. The question is whether anyone will be allowed to hear him, because the same machinery that kept Elvis quiet while he was alive, that kept his death clean and his legacy profitable, is running right now. The same attorneys, the same NDAs. The same slow, quiet pressure applied in the right places at the right time. The only difference is that this time there's a record. This time, the evidence is in his handwriting. And this time, the world is watching. If this story reached you, don't let it stop here. Share this video before it disappears into an algorithm designed to reward silence. Subscribe to this channel because the stories that powerful estates spend millions burying are the only ones worth telling. Elvis wrote it down, he sealed it, he waited. Now it's your turn to make sure his voice is finally heard.